Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 280 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. The American Revolution is embedded in the American character. It's an event that can tell us who we are, how we came to be who we are, and how we can strive to be who we want to be as a nation and as a people. It's because the revolution has so much to tell us about who we are as Americans that each generation has had many scholars who have investigated and interrogated the revolution and its war for meaning and answers. And the generations living in the present day are no different from generations of the past. Today, we meet with Rick Atkinson, a 3-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize, a journalist who has worked at the Washington Post, and the author of the book, The British Are Coming: The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. Now, like so many, Rick has turned to the American Revolution for answers. Specifically, he hopes to explore the contributions the War for Independence made to our national character as Americans. So, during our conversation, Rick reveals why it is important for us to view the American Revolution through the eyes of both the British and American perspectives, the scarcity both the British and American armies experienced during the war, and the violence and devastation of the War for Independence, and what that violence and devastation can tell us about who we are and how we came to be who we are as Americans. But first, did you know that it takes roughly 1 hour of work to produce each minute you hear on this podcast? It takes a lot of time and resources to produce Ben Franklin's World, and the Omohundro Institute and I could really use your help to keep it going, which is why we're asking you to support Ben Franklin's World by joining our subscription program, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. For less than you would typically pay to visit your favorite history museum each month, you can help us deliver several thought-provoking conversations with today's top historians. Plus, subscribers to our new subscription program will not only receive a bonus episode on the last Friday of each month. Going forward, they'll never have to hear another mid-roll ad again. So become a subscriber, join our subscription program, benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe, and help us continue to bring exciting new historical scholarship right to your ears. Join us at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. All right, are you ready to explore the War for Independence? Let's go meet our guest historian. Our guest is a 3-time winner of the Pulitzer Prize. He has worked as a reporter, foreign correspondent, and senior editor at the Washington Post. He's also written numerous books, including The Liberation Trilogy, a series on the history of World War II, and, most recently, the first volume of an intended trilogy on the American Revolution. It's called The British Are Coming: The War for America, Lexington to Princeton, 1775 to 1777. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Rick Atkinson.
Thank you, Liz. Thanks for having me.
So, Rick, I'm curious what brings you to the American Revolution. Because you've written extensively about the military history of the war in Iraq, and you've written several books on the history of World War II. But now you've jumped from the 21st and 20th centuries back to the 18th century. So, welcome to the 18th century. What brings you here?
It's a very nice place to live these days, I have to say. I'd written 6 books, all on American wars, all wars in the 20th and 21st centuries. When I was approaching the end of writing volume 3 of my Liberation Trilogy, which is about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II, thinking about what to do next, the obvious thing would have been to pivot to the Pacific and do for that theater what I had done for the Mediterranean and Western European theaters. But I just didn't have the heart for it, partly because I would have had to start World War II all over again at Pearl Harbor or even earlier. And I frankly couldn't shake a fascination that I've had since I was a kid with an earlier century and an earlier war. I constantly reminded myself of Jack London's advice that a writer ought not wait for inspiration to find him, that he ought to light out after it with a club. And so I decided that what I was going to do next was the American Revolution, because I thought when I started it in 2013, started the first volume, which was just published in May, that it was important, that it told us something about who we are and where we came from and what our forebears believe. And I think the most profound question any people can ask themselves, what they were willing to die for. And now in 2019, I think it's even more important. I think it's absolutely vital that we understand these issues and understand what the revolution has to tell us about who we are and who we aspire to be.
Well, childhood fascinations with the American Revolution and wanting to know who we are and how we got here is certainly something I can relate to. So, welcome to the revolution. I'm glad you're working on it. Now, before we dive into the story you want to tell about the American Revolution, I'd like for us to talk about the title of your book, The British Are Coming, which is a saying that is often erroneously attributed to Paul Revere, thanks to the wordsmithing of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. So, how did you come to choose this phrase as the title of your book?
Yeah, why the British are coming. I was just in New York, and the New York Historical Society has a fine new exhibition on Paul Revere. And as many of us know, Paul Revere did not yell, "The British are coming," on the early morning of April 19th, 1775, the day the war began. That wouldn't have made much sense to people who, for the most part, still considered themselves to be British at that time. What he's quoted as yelling over and over again on his famous ride is, "The regulars are coming out," meaning the regular British Army coming out of Boston. But I use "The British are coming" as a title because it's really a metaphor for what the first couple of years of the war that I cover in this book are about. The British are coming. They're bringing more than half of their professional, ferocious army. They're bringing almost half of the greatest navy the world has ever seen. They're bringing 30,000 German mercenaries, the Hessians, and they're coming to kill your men, rape your women, plunder your homes, and in some cases, burn your town to ashes. It's a dire thing. And so it seems to me that in terms of capturing what the American rebels are facing, this phrase does just that.
It really is an apt phrase or metaphor for the period that you're covering in this book, which is 1775 to 1777. Now, I would like to ask you a question about your research so that we can get a behind-the-scenes look at The British Are Coming. Now, in addition to being my production partner on Ben Franklin's World, the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture is also the primary U.S. partner of the Georgian Papers program, which is this great initiative to digitize all the papers of Great Britain's King Georges and their respective households. Now, Rick, in 2016, the Omohundro Institute supported this book when you were a fellow of the Georgian Papers program. And Mark would like to know about your experiences working in Windsor Castle and among the papers of King George III. So, would you tell us what it was like to be an OI fellow and to work in King George III's papers?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about it, and I'm grateful to the Omohundro Institute and to Karen Wolf, the director, and others at Omohundro who helped me and encouraged me along the way. I stumbled into it rather oddly. I often work at the Society of the Cincinnati Library in Washington, where I live, and often when I sign in the morning, I am the last previous person to have signed in. It's not excessively used place, even though it's a wonderful library. One day, I think it was early 2016, I signed in and I saw that on the previous day, they had had three visitors, one from the royal household, one from King's College in London, and one from Windsor Castle. And I asked the librarian what they were doing there, and she told me about this project, the Georgian Papers program, which intends to digitize and catalog the papers of the four Georges who became king in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I was told that the Omohundro Institute was, in fact, their partner. And so I emailed Karen Wolf that afternoon, and she promptly responded. And the next thing I know, I'm spending the month of April 2016 in Windsor. Now, the experience was really wonderful. I mean, first and foremost, I would show my badge every day at the Henry VIII Gate at Windsor Castle, which is just west of London, and then show it again at the Norman Gate and climb 102 stone steps and 21 wooden stairs to the garret of the Round Tower begun by William the Conqueror in the 11th century. And there are the papers. That's where they've been kept for a long time in gorgeous, oversized red binders. And there are in the Georgian papers about 350,000 pages. Most of them have not been published previously. Most of them belong to the reign of George III, who was king for 60 years. And You have a very tactile sense of being in George's presence as you go through these papers. I also had the pleasure of being in Windsor the month the Queen, who owns the papers and who's the one who authorized this digitization project, turned 90 years old. So she was living in the castle at Windsor. There's a great sense of celebration and achievement by the royal family. So that was fun. And of course, it's a charming little town. What I found in this month-long relationship with George III is a number of things. One of my ambitions in this book is to tell the story of the revolution and the first couple of years of the revolution covered in volume one from both the British perspective and the American perspective. And so what I find is that George, of course, is not the mincing nitwit who dominates our imagination. And even tonight we'll be prancing across the stage in Hamilton somewhere. But rather, he's a man of parts. He's curious about everything. He's interested in everything from astronomy and horology, the study of time, to the use of manures in agronomy. I read not only his papers relevant to my period, I read the papers of Charlotte, this obscure, drab German princess he married 6 hours after he met her. She produces children with lunar regularity to number 15. And you see that George is a caring father. He's invested in the rearing of the kids, two of whom will become king. I read the papers of Charlotte. I read the papers of George IV as he becomes, and William IV as he becomes. William was in the Royal Navy in New York toward the end of the Revolution. And among other things in George's papers, you see he's a great list maker. He's his own secretary until late in life when he begins to go blind, and he writes not only most of his correspondence himself, he makes the copies himself. And the lists he compiles include lists of all British regiments in America from 1765 to 1774. He tallies long columns of the number of officers and rank and file and musicians in each regiment. You see his arithmetic scratchings in the margins as he does his sums. And of course, the correspondence is profound. He is, it has to be said, the hardest of the hardliners in London when it comes to waging war against the colonies. And among other things, I see the strategic misconceptions that he and his ministers and Parliament, to a large degree, have and are making that cause them to lose the war in the long run. The most interesting of the misconceptions, I think, is his absolute conviction that if the American colonies are permitted to slip away, it's the beginning of the end of the British Empire, which is a new construct created in 1763 with their victory over France and Spain in the 7 Years' War. And if the American colonies are successful in breaking away, it will encourage insurrections in Canada, in the Sugar Islands of the West Indies, in Ireland, in India, and the British Empire will dissolve. They will be fallen upon by their enemies in continental Europe, primarily France. And this is an article of faith with him almost to the end of the war. And you really do see that in the Georgian papers.
That's really fascinating. And I guess just to push you a bit more while we're here, were there other ways that getting to know King George III more personally and intimately through his papers shaped or changed your views of the American Revolution?
I'm more sympathetic to him, I think, than I had been. I certainly know him better than I had. I recognize that the war he's waging, this 8-year war across 3,000 miles of open ocean, is not nonsensical and simply vindictive from his standpoint. I find him a kind of endearing character. He's, of course, not crazy in the 1770s. The afflictions that beset him late in life really have not manifested themselves. He's really at the peak of his powers, physically and mentally. He can be ornery and stubborn. There's no doubt about that. He can be wrong-headed about a number of things. And yet I find that his Catholic interests, wide range of his intellect, his clear concern for both family and country, he writes little theater reviews. He's a great theater goer, and he'll write a review of some actor that he's seen has a steely mien, a particularly effective Brutus. His domestic life is charming, actually. And then his, it has to be said that as the Captain General of British forces, he's a pretty ferocious war wagerer. He's constantly trying to buck up Lord North, his childhood friend, who's first minister, prime minister, we would call him. North really doesn't have the heart to be a war minister. And George is the one who's really driving the train, who's telling North, no, we got to do this. This is critical to the future of the empire. And so you see this mixed bag in his traits and in his qualities, which, of course, for a narrative writer like me, makes him endlessly fascinating.
Now, as we said at the start of our conversation, Rick's book, The British Are Coming, is really the first volume in what will be a 3-volume series on the American Revolution. Rick, could you tell us a bit more about your intended trilogy and the work that this first volume does to set up the story that you want to tell about the American Revolution?
I have to confess that I don't think that a trilogy is necessarily the wisest or most necessary form that every narrative history should take. I spent 15 years doing a trilogy on the American role in the liberation of Europe. When I started this work, I was not initially thinking of a trilogy, which is a real commitment. But as I studied the story and began thinking about how I wanted to tell it, and particularly telling it from different angles, including the British perspective, it just seemed to me that it broke more or less naturally into 3 parts. So this first volume ends with the 2 American victories at Trenton, and then the American victory in a large skirmish at Princeton in January 1777. It's a natural place to end the story for this first volume, because then Washington takes his armies to northern New Jersey near Morristown. They go into winter quarters, and things go more or less quiet for months. And that gives us an opportunity to kind of count the beans and decide how things have turned out in the first couple of years of the war. My intent, and I've begun working on research for the second volume, is to pick up the story in 1777 and probably take it through the Battle of Charleston in May of 1780. It's a terrible defeat for the Americans. The army of 5,500 men is killed or captured. The British have taken back Georgia. They're in the process of taking a good part of South Carolina. The British finally, who after years of stumbling around in various strategic misdirections, seem to have found the right strategy. They're rolling up the colonies from the South. And I think that's a pretty good place to end that volume. And then the last couple years of the war, of course, are almost exclusively in the South. And General Greene comes into his own as a field commander, one of the greatest field commanders in the history of the American Army. We have Arnold's treason in the fall of 1780, of course, but for the most part, the action is in the South, leading to Yorktown. And then, of course, the war doesn't end with Yorktown. There's still some nasty skirmishing to be done, but for all intents and purposes, the Americans have won, and it just requires dotting the I's and crossing the T's in the treaty in 1783. So that's my plan. I have to say, I have no illusions that it's going to take me less than 15 years, which is what the first trilogy did, and I'm older and slower now. So I have my work cut out for me.
Do you think that your past experience as a journalist, a war correspondent who has researched and written a lot about war, do you think that this past experience has helped you get at the violence of the war for independence in a new way from other scholars?
Well, there are plenty of great other scholars out there who have not been journalists and are fine writers and researchers. And, I tip my hat to them over and over again. I can't do it without them. And I have no pretense of supplanting them in any way. I do think that having been a journalist for a long time, particularly at the Washington Post, and having been a war correspondent in places like Somalia and Bosnia and Iraq, Afghanistan, gives me some understanding of what it's like to command, among other things. Also what it's like to fight. I'm also an Army brat. I grew up on military posts. My father was an infantry officer for his entire adult life from the age of 18. So I understand the culture of the U.S. Army. And I think that I've got an appreciation not only of that culture, but I speak the language. I have some sense of the ethic and the sacrifice soldiers then and now. An infantryman is an infantryman is an infantryman. And though the weapons are different and the training is different, and today's soldier is much more physically fit and better educated and all that, infantry life is infantry life. And having shared it to some small degree in places like Iraq, I know what it's like. So I think that does give me some appreciation of it, even in the 18th century.
Well, now that we're on the topic of infantry life, as you recounted the early warfare and the War for Independence in The British Are Coming, you noted how both armies, the Continental and the British Army, suffered from scarcity. A scarcity of food, equipment, money, medicine, clothing, and really just about any supplies that an army needs to make war. So could you tell us a bit more about this scarcity and why there just seemed to be so much of it during the War for Independence? Also, how did this scarcity manifest in the British Army? Because I think a lot of us are accustomed to thinking about how the Continental Army was so poorly supplied during this war, but I don't think many of us have really considered how the British Army was poorly supplied during this war.
It's a very interesting part of the whole conflict. There's a line sometimes attributed to General Omar Bradley from World War II that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. Logistics is not a word that existed during the American Revolution, but they certainly knew what it was. It's basically trying to figure out how to supply your force. That includes not only feeding and providing the munitions necessary, but providing the fodder needed for horses, because if you don't have horses to pull your wagons and your artillery carriages, you can't go anywhere. You know, General Washington, in the 75 official letters that he writes in January and February 1776, more than half of them make reference to munition shortages, particularly gunpowder, which he just calls the thing. And he writes about it in pleading, fretful terms. The shortages for the Americans are across the board, and they're enduring really for the whole course of the revolution. There are moments when things brighten. Eventually, they've got enough muskets. Their artillery, which is in very short supply early on, is in better hands, and they eventually get enough of the thing, gunpowder. But they're short of salt. You need salt to cure beef and fish, if you want to go anywhere. It takes 2 bushels of salt, more than 100 pounds, to cure 1,000 pounds of pork. The Americans are desperate for salt because the British embargo, which begins when the shooting starts, has cut off 2/3 of the supply of salt from the West Indies and from Europe. They're short of paper. Paper is critically important for printing money, which they're doing to beat the band. They're printing $200 million. It's how they're financing the revolution. Of course, it's ruinous in the long run, but just trying to get enough paper. You need paper to make musket cartridges. So the Americans are plagued with these shortages and with these challenges right from the get-go. The British, we think, Britain has the greatest empire in the world at this time. They are at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. They are really ascendant. They're prosperous and they're inventive and they're feeling their oats. And they have this new empire as a consequence of the 7 Years' War. The sun never sets on the British Empire. That's the phrase that was coined in 1773. And yet they underestimate the difficulty of waging war across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail for 8 years. So when the British are in Boston in 1775-76, and they're essentially surrounded by the Americans after the opening shots of the war on Bunker Hill, you find that, first of all, they can't venture into the countryside in America. This is true for almost the entire war, to gather food and forage without being ambushed. And so they are reliant on a steady stream of supply ships, hundreds of ships ultimately, from British and Irish ports to bring to them everything from food for soldiers to fodder for their animals to gunpowder and everything else that you need to run an army. In Boston, in that first winter, of the 40 or so supply ships that are sent to Boston from Britain and Ireland, most of them never arrive directly. They're blown by gales back to Britain. They're blown by gales to the West Indies. They're intercepted by rebel marauders. When the ships actually arrive, and they're bringing, in one case, 550 Lincolnshire sheep, considered the best breed to undergo the rigors of transatlantic travel. Well, the 550 sheep that have been sent out alive, only 40 arrive alive, because transatlantic travel turns out to be really hard on sheep, whether they're Lincolnshire or otherwise. The same is true with hogs. The flour and other food supplies that are sent often arrives infested with Irish rats or musty and ruined. So this is a problem that the British have underestimated. It's a problem that they will fight throughout the course of the war. Nobody starves to death for the British. The Americans, on the other hand, are very close to starving to death in several instances, but it really crimps their ability to wage war the way they want to. And I think trying to understand these logistical challenges, trying to understand how it impinges on the operational decisions that are made by General Gage, the first commander in Boston, General Howe, who succeeds him, General Clinton, who will be the longest serving British commander-in-chief, trying to understand what it is that they're facing when it comes to these supply issues is important to understanding why the war goes as it does.
And yet it still seems that even though they can't wage the type of war that they both want to wage, both sides do wage war in a very devastating manner, which is something that was very clear in The British Are Coming. So, Rick, would you tell us more about the devastation of this war and what it meant for the War for Independence, and maybe which battles you think were the most devastating?
Yeah, in the 18th century, combat is unusually intimate. It's fought at close range, often face to face, often with a bayonet. That's partly because muskets are largely inaccurate beyond 80 yards. They're pretty much hopeless beyond 100 yards. And that requires soldiers to close with one another and to fight it out face to face. And that leads to just vicious hand-to-hand combat. Now, it should also be said that even though muskets are inaccurate, when they're fired in volleys by clusters of men, sending 1-ounce lead slugs downrange at 1,000 feet a second, that can be devastating. Given the primitive inadequacy of 18th century medicine, which is hardly worthy of the name, if you're hit in the torso by a musket ball, you have less than a 50% chance of surviving. If you're hit in the head, your chance of survival is even worse. So it's nasty whether you're talking about the kind of shooting that's going on or whether you're talking about the ferocity of bayonet attacks. You know, you start with Bunker Hill if you want to understand how just bloody awful it is. The British have decided that they need to attack the American entrenchments. They're not even entrenched yet. They're just American positions across the Charles River from Boston. The Americans have arrived in the middle of the night and dug some crude redoubts. They've done it badly. They've put it on the lower ground on Breed's Hill rather than the higher ground at Bunker Hill. The battle will be called Bunker Hill, of course, even though most of the fighting is on Breed's Hill. The British wake up early in the morning, June 17th, 1775, see the Americans swarming across the hillside, across the river, and decide, well, we can't stand that. We're going to have to just sweep them away. Under General Howe, with General Gage's orders, the British muster and attack these entrenchments. The fight goes on for the better part of 4 hours, and the British have more than 1,000 casualties. They have 226 dead. 1 of every 8 British officer killed in 8 years of war dies in 4 hours at Bunker Hill. General Howe, who has led the attack, as generals did in those days, from the front, marching up the hill, comes back down the hill unscathed himself. He has not suffered a scratch, but every member of his staff who's with him is killed or wounded. Howe's leggings are covered in blood. It's really nasty. And the suffering that goes on at Bunker Hill and in the days after Bunker Hill, with those who are wounded and cannot expect any succor from the surgeons who are assigned to 18th century armies, it's heartbreaking. And I don't care whether you're pro-American or pro-British or indifferent, it's just heartbreaking. And this is going to happen over and over again. And it's not just combat. There are 100,000 people who die of smallpox in North America from 1775 to 1782. Smallpox, the king of terrors. Is there a more awful way to die? If there is, I don't know about it. And it strikes the lowborn and it strikes generals. American commander in Canada in that ill-fated expedition, General Thomas, who's a physician, dies of smallpox, dies terribly of smallpox, his body just melting away from the pox. So we see that, and then, another kind of awfulness involved is the fraternal aspects of it. If you're loyal to the crown, even if your family has arrived on the Mayflower and you've been in America for 150 years, or even if you're just a fence straddler uncertain of the wisdom of armed rebellion against your government, you're subject to dreadful treatment, disenfranchisement, confiscation of your property, beatings, torture, exile, and sometimes even execution. Loyalists were placed on scows anchored in the Hudson River below Albany, or sometimes were lowered into an abandoned Connecticut copper mine 70 feet below ground, lowered by windlass into rock-walled cells that were known simply as hell. This aspect of the war is bad from the beginning, meaning the treatment of brothers as a consequence of irreconcilable political differences, and it's going to get worse as the war goes along. We see families ripped apart by irreconcilable political differences, including Benjamin Franklin's. His beloved son, William, who has participated with him in his experiments, the kite flying experiment and all the rest. Franklin talks about the happiest moments of his life were those spent with his beloved son. William is the royal governor of New Jersey, thanks in part to Franklin's influence, and he refuses to renounce his allegiance to the king. William will be frog-marched off to jail in Connecticut, treated quite badly, and they will never really reconcile. It's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking in the same way that the schisms that occur in the Civil War within families, within a people occur. So this is the revolution. This is what the revolution gives us. And you realize, among other things, how hard-hearted you have to be in order to wage this kind of war successfully. Civil wars are always really nasty, and this one's no exception.
Just listening to your descriptions of the war, it really sounds like there was truth to Thomas Paine's line in Common Sense when he said that these are the times that try men's souls.
Yeah, the physical conditions are awful. Paine knows it firsthand because he has gone out and served basically as a soldier, not really a combatant per se, but he's living with the army with General Greene during the retreat across New Jersey, which is really about the nadir of the war for the Americans in December of 1776. And Paine knows very well. He's not only got a keen political nose, and of course he's a polemicist of the first order, he has a pretty good understanding of 18th century military tactics. It's not entirely clear to me. He comes by this naturally because he's never really been a soldier. But he knows what soldiering is like. He knows what the misery of combat is like. And he knows the sacrifice and the suffering that's required in order to see this through to a successful conclusion.
So, if you're an American or British military commander, what do you do to keep your men in this fight? Because as we've been talking about, they face chronic shortages of supply, lots of violence, devastation, death, disease, and in some cases, this war ripped apart their families. So, how did officers keep their men in this fight?
Yeah, boy, that is a really good question, Liz. Why do they keep fighting? And 240 some years later, we can still ask ourselves that. Well, in some cases, they don't, of course. Desertion is very high on both sides. In the case of the militia, the Continental Army is created with Washington as commander in an effort to professionalize the force. Washington is a great advocate for this, believing that militias, which are local units that turn out for short periods of time, are not especially well trained in many cases, not particularly well disciplined in many cases. He believes that militias just cannot stand up against a professional army, not to mention the professional navy that the British have. If you're a militiaman and you've got to get in the wheat crop, or you got to go harvest your crops, or your family's going to starve to death, literally, then you're inclined to walk away when you've got to walk away. And this happens over and over again. This happens, season after season. It becomes very hard to rely on the militias, even though they're critically important and they're more important and more valuable than Washington tends to give credit. The soldiers who are in the professional army, and eventually they're enlisting for, initially, of course, it's for short-term enlistments for a year, and they're extended to 3 years, and some will enlist for the duration. Nevertheless, there's a great deal of discontent. Among other things, you're being paid in continental dollars from those $200 million that have been printed by the Congress promiscuously. And the consequence is that the depreciation of that money is profound. And by 1779, the money is worthless. It's hardly worth the paper it's printed on. And so if you're a soldier or a young officer and you're getting paid $40 a month or whatever, that $40 is not worth much. It's hard to support your family back in Massachusetts or New York or Virginia on that. And there's great discontent about that. There's mutinies or near mutinies in several cases. They're terribly fed, particularly at places like Valley Forge, largely because of the incompetence of the supply system and the incompetence of Congress in helping to take care of them. So why do they fight? Why do they stick with it? And the reasons, I think, touch on the reasons that soldiers through the ages have stuck with it through all kinds of misery and danger, have basically forsworn the comforts of home for the soldiering life. In many cases, it's because of the camaraderie that they find in the ranks. I've seen this personally firsthand. I know how true it is. You're risking your life, in some cases giving your life, not so much for a cause or an ideal or a flag. You're doing it for your brothers, now your brothers and sisters. You don't want to be seen as less than the soldier on your left, the soldier on your right, your brothers. And so you're willing to go through a great deal for this unique relationship that you find, this brotherhood that blooms on battlefields as it blooms nowhere else in quite the same way. Of course, in many cases, they're doing it because they believe in the cause. They're patriots. They've thought about what it is they want America to be. They've thought about the grievances they hold against Britain. They've thought about what it is that they think that war can get them, and they're willing to do it. Now, let's remember that in a country of 2.5 million people, 500,000 of whom, by the way, are black slaves, Washington's army at times is as small as 3,000 men. That's a very small portion committed to the cause in bearing arms. And it's a constant struggle for Washington to keep the ranks filled, to build up enough of a critical mass to be able to fight effectively against the British. And so we can talk about how soldiers showed the grit needed to do it while remembering that it's a fairly small proportion of the population. As the war goes on, the notion of a patriot leaving his plow in the furrow to grab the musket and go off in defense of freedom is ever more a myth. A lot of the rank and file are from the poorer and more disenfranchised, unconnected, I won't say dregs because that does them a disservice. They're not dregs, but they're often immigrants. They're often single. They don't have deep roots in their communities. And the army is a way for them to make some money, even though not worth a continental is a phrase that will soon enough be upon them. In counterinsurgency doctrine in the 21st century, we talk about the human topography. General Petraeus talks about the human topography a lot, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq. And the human topography of 18th century America is extremely complex. It's fascinating. And understanding that topography and trying to negotiate that topography is a challenge of the first order for Washington and the other commanders and the Congress.
Now that we have a good sense of the overall context of the military situation during the War for Independence, I'd like for us to turn to some of the specific military actions that Rick covers in his book, The British Are Coming. For example, did you know that American submarine warfare started in the War for Independence with an operation called the Turtle? This is just one of the military aspects that Rick covers, and that we're going to explore next, right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. Have you ever had a chance to look at George Washington's military papers? These papers are filled with letters to Congress, asking for help with all that scarcity that Rick was telling us about. Sometimes, I wonder how many more messages Washington would have sent to Congress if the instant communication of email had been available in the 18th century. If email had existed, both Congress and Washington would have needed SaneBox. SaneBox helps those who are inundated with email respond to messages that matter most. SaneBox is a service that automatically sorts your email into several folders using your preferred email service provider. So you don't have to change any of your habits by creating a new email account or downloading a new app. SaneBox just works to make your existing email service more awesome. So, how does SaneBox do this? How does it work to make your existing email service more awesome? Let me offer you a few real examples, as I've been using SaneBox for 3 years. I use SaneBox on top of my Gmail accounts. SaneBox helped me create a few new folders for organizing my email, so that as new messages flow into my inbox, SaneBox can triage and sort my messages. So SaneBox makes sure that I see all my important emails in my inbox, sorts my weekly podcast and tech newsletters into my podcast and tech folder, and it sorts messages that might be of interest but also distracting into a Sane Later folder. SaneBox's automatic sorting of my email keeps me focused on my most important emails and keeps emails that might be of interest but also a bit distracting in other folders so that I can browse them whenever I have time. Plus, SaneBox has other tools that I really like and use, like the Sane Black Hole. Have you ever tried to unsubscribe from an email newsletter or sales email? You know how hard it is to try and find that little link somewhere on the email that lets you unsubscribe? Well, SaneBox makes unsubscribing easy. Just place any email you don't want to receive anymore into the Sane Black Hole, and poof, you'll never see those emails again. I also really like Sane Reminders. Have you ever sent an email with an important question and then forgotten about that email while you worked on other things? SaneBox helps ensure that these unresponded emails don't fall through the cracks. In 2 to 3 days, SaneBox returns the unreplied email into your inbox so that you can decide whether or not you should follow up. I really love SaneBox, and you can try SaneBox for yourself with a free 2-week trial. Visit sanebox.com/bfworld today to start your free trial and get a $25 credit. That's sanebox.com/BFWORLD to start your free trial. sanebox.com/bfworld. Rick, I was really excited to see that you covered lesser well-known operations like the turtle. So, would you tell us about the turtle?
Yeah, the turtle is a fantastic bit of American invention. There's a Yale graduate named David Bushnell who is a tinkerer. And Bushnell believes that, among other things, he can invent a submersible. And he works on it, and it's extraordinarily clever. I won't go into the details, but it's basically a one-man submarine. It can be piloted underwater with some difficulty. He puts it together. He convinces Washington that this has some possibilities against the Royal Navy, which, of course, is the greatest fleet the world's ever seen. He provides Bushnell with encouragement and a little money. And the thing is brought to the southern tip of Manhattan. And the submariner, the one-man crew who's going to pilot this thing, is a sergeant named Ezra Lee. Bushnell's brother was going to do it, but he gets sick and he can't do it. So Lee doesn't have much training in it. But the plan is to send the turtle out into New York Harbor and to attack the Eagle, which is the flagship of Admiral Lord Richard Howe, the commander of the British fleet in North America. It's launched in the dark of night. Lee winds his way through British ships that are anchored in the harbor. The tide is difficult. The currents are difficult. He goes the wrong direction for a while. Finally, he arrives and he's up against the hull of this big frigate. The explosive device that Bushnell has invented is in a big jug, really, and it can be attached to the hull of a ship. It's got 100 pounds of explosives in it. By sheer mischance, bad luck, Bushnell is trying to attach it to a part of the ship where he's got a little auger and he's trying to drill a hole into the ship to fasten this thing. And he happens to be doing it where there's a metal plate. Dawn is coming. He's afraid of being discovered. He's going to be discovered. So he decides to abandon it and starts making his way back. It's well over a mile back to the southern tip of Manhattan. As dawn's breaking, the British, who are on Governor's Island, see him. They give chase. He releases this charge. It's a kind of depth charge, really. And it blows up, a huge explosion. No one knows quite what it is. He gets the turtle back. He survives this adventure. Turtle survives. There's never another opportunity for this kind of submarine warfare. The turtle is lost in the Hudson River later, and Admiral Howe really has no idea how close he is to being assassinated.
That's really another continuous aspect of war that the turtle demonstrates, right? That war is often a time where we see the development of lots of different and new technologies.
Yeah, that's certainly true. And I think it's a good insight. Desperate times drive men to come up with desperate notions. The British, for example, and this is very important to them in their subsequent wars, in the Napoleonic Wars, the British realized that if they can figure out a way to keep their ships from fouling, algae and barnacles and whatnot growing on the bottom of ships makes them much slower. And they periodically have to be brought in and cleansed, basically scraping all this crud off of them. Otherwise, it can make the ships very difficult to handle. It's a real impediment. And they decide to try to experiment with coppering their ships. And there's copper sheeting that's put on. And it takes some time to figure out how to do it properly because it has to be attached in a certain way. But in the Revolution, we see the first coppered ships begin to appear. And it gives a real advantage to a captain whose ship has this sleek metallic bottom to it. That's an example of your theory that we see advances technologically that are applicable to warfare. And of course, in later wars, in World War II, for example, we see everything from the jet fighters to the atomic bomb.
Now, another aspect of the British are coming that I'd like for us to talk about is something we haven't really talked about on this podcast before. And those would be the battles of Trenton and Princeton in December 1776 and January 1777. Rick, could you tell us about these important battles?
Yeah, things are so dark in December 1776 as Washington is retreating, having been evicted from New York in a sequence of really unfortunate defeats. And he's retreating across New Jersey. His army is down to about 3,000 men. He crosses westbound across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. He writes his brother, I think the game is pretty near up. He's very despondent. The American cause seems to be flickering. And again, desperation will cause desperate men to do desperate things. He decides that he's got very little to lose. He's got pretty good intelligence that the British who have chased him across the Delaware are headed into winter quarters, and they've left outposts in New Jersey. And particularly, there's an outpost with about almost 1,000 Hessian soldiers at Trenton. Trenton is right on the Delaware, just upriver from Philadelphia. And Washington decides that it's worth the gamble to cross and try to attack that garrison on Christmas night, 1776. And he does exactly that. It doesn't go well. It doesn't go right initially. His intent is to cross 3 different places and to attack from 3 different directions. The 2 southernmost attack forces can't get across the Delaware River because it's so choked with ice. It's a very nasty night, sleeting and cold and miserable. Washington, with the main force above Trenton, does manage to get across, famously, and they fall on the garrison, catch them completely by surprise. The Hessians are not drunk, contrary to mythology. They are not led by an incompetent commander, Colonel Rahl. They have, in fact, been alert for quite some time because there have been smaller American raids on their outposts and on their sentries. But they are caught by surprise. They are routed. Rahl is killed. Some of the Hessians get away, but most of them are captured, and quite a few of them are killed. And Washington does, this is a great thing. It's a bold strike, and it's an extraordinary bit of generalship from a commanding general who had not shown a lot of great generalship. What he does next, I think, is really extraordinary because he decides that he's going to double down. Instead of crossing back to Pennsylvania and collecting his winnings, taking a victory lap, he decides that he's going to cross the Delaware River again, eastbound. This time, he does it with the intent of setting himself up in Trenton and gulling the British to attack him there. He's got good positions. The British are moving down from Princeton. They attack. They take some pretty substantial losses, but they're well positioned when the next morning is coming to try to outflank Washington and to put an end to him. And again, Washington does a remarkable tactical maneuver instead of trying to get back across the Delaware, which is really impossible because the ice is so bad, or fleeing south into South Jersey, he goes east. He goes around the left flank of the British Army, which is facing him across the creek in Trenton in the middle of the night, leaving fires burning and men hacking at the ground with picks to make the British think that there's still an army over there, when in fact the army has slipped off to the east to Princeton, where Washington, again with good intelligence, knows the British rear guard has been left and is vulnerable. They're exposed in the same way that the Hessian garrison had been initially. And in the early January of 1777, there is a pretty nasty fight, casualties on both sides, but the British rear guard is destroyed. Washington remains in Princeton for really only an hour or two, and then slips away because he knows that the British main force is going to be after him. They hear the shooting 11, 12 miles away in Princeton, and they are after him, but he slips away and he goes into northern New Jersey, where the terrain is rugged near Morristown. It's a good place to go into winter quarters. He's safe there. The British cannot chase him there in the wintertime. And that's going to be the end of the campaign of 1776. It ends with these 3 victories, really, and resuscitates hope that had really seemed all but extinguished at that point. Washington is hailed as a battlefield genius. He's not, but he's had a good run of luck there. And it gives a shot in the arm to recruiting. It gives the men who are fighting under him, including his subordinate commanders, a real feeling that, okay, we can slug it out with these guys. They might be rough and tough, and they've got a lot going for them, the British do, but we can do this. So it's a pretty critical turning point in the war.
Rick, before we jump into the time warp, you mentioned earlier that it's a real commitment to write 3 books on any subject, and you are writing 3 books about the American Revolution. So when you think about that, what is the story or the overall message about the American Revolution that you'd really like to convey to your readers? What do you want us to know about the American Revolution?
Well, I think, there are lessons that we can take away, and it doesn't require real careful parsing. First of all, this nation was born bickering. Disputation is in the national genome. It's important to know that as we bicker today at a time when our political rancor seems ever more toxic. We have had the good fortune through 240 years of history to have leaders emerge with the skills and the characteristics needed to help us see our way through. And these characteristics, they're embodied by Washington, frankly, even though, yes, he had more than 300 slaves when he died at Mount Vernon in 1799. You cannot square that circle morally, but he represents Republican virtues, small r, including a commitment to cause larger than himself, absolute probity, an extraordinary sense of willingness to sacrifice. These are characteristics that we should demand in our leaders at all levels. They're absolutely vital to the success of the subsequent republic. And I think that having more than a nodding acquaintance with who these men, and they were mostly men back then, were, and the traits that they embodied, for good and ill, is pretty critical to feeling our way forward. So I think that those are vital. Also, no matter how dark our situation seems today, and boy, it seems dark at times, I think it's very important to know that we have found our way through greater perils in the past, existential perils. We've done it repeatedly, starting with the Revolution and the Civil War and World War II. These are all existential threats to all that we profess to hold dear. And that should be of great comfort, that we have resolve and the grit and the capacity to work our way through these challenges to who we are and what we aspire to be. And so I think that the revolution shows us it's a bright mirror in which we can see traits that fashion the American character. It includes brutality and some other unpleasant aspects of the American character, but it also includes resilience and inventiveness and commitment. And all of that can be teased out of the creation story that we find in the Revolution.
Now it's time for the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if the British Army had been better supplied? How would the war for American independence have been different if the British Army had had all the supplies it needed to wage war?
I don't think supply was the critical component that the British lacked for success. Yeah, they had difficulties for all the reasons that we discussed earlier. And had they been fully flush with everything that was required, it may have emboldened General Howe, for example, or General Clinton in a way that they were reluctant to risk their army. They're 3,000 miles away. Those troops are not replaceable. So there were moments of timidity by the British commanders. But I think that the larger problem for the British is that they really have an absence of leadership, both strategically and operationally. They're a very good army. They've got a lot of experience. Most of the officers have had at least some experience, perhaps in the 7 Years' War. The senior officers all have had extensive combat experience, and yet they're really not stellar. They're not great captains. There's not a great captain among them, meaning somebody who can see a battlefield spatially and temporally and dominate it the way that a Napoleon can or a Ulysses Grant can. And then it's compounded by the fact that British leadership at home is really pretty limp. There's not a uniform commitment to the cause. There's a rigorous, noisy set of dissenters, including some of the best orators that Parliament has seen in the 18th century, men like Burke and Chatham. And the king's ministers tend to be mostly mediocrities. It's important to remember that George III never left England in his long life. He never even went to Scotland. He doesn't really have an appreciation for what the colonies have become. And there's nobody in his cabinet who's ever been to America. So they don't really understand what the colonies have become. They don't understand the extent to which these two peoples, British and American, have diverged in their value set. So the critical issue, I think, for the British tends to be more one of leadership than for want of tangible goods.
Now, Rick, you mentioned earlier that you have started researching the second book in your Revolution trilogy. Could you give us a preview?
Yeah. My ambition is to pick up the story and to tell it as a story. It's one of the great stories in the history of the Western canon, to tell it from both sides, to tell it with some sympathy, to be deep in details. I am a detail guy, and I think details really help to understand what the personalities and the issues are about, what 18th century warfare is about. So there's a lot that happens in this next volume, from Brandywine and Germantown and Monmouth, Valley Forge, French coming into it, Saratoga, and all of that. So I am at it hammer and tongs.
If we have more questions about the military aspects of the Revolution, how can we get in contact with you?
I easily reached through the website, revolutiontrilogy.com or www.rickatkinsonbooks.com. I read every query and question and comment and complaint that comes in, and I try to answer most of them. So that's the best way to do it.
Rick Atkinson, thank you for joining us and for helping us better understand the War for Independence.
Liz, thanks very much for the conversation. I enjoyed it very much.
No matter how dark our situation may seem today, it's important to know that the American people have found their way through greater perils in the past. Perils that have been existential and perils that have been violent and caused great upheaval. As Rick noted, the American Revolution shows us traits that have become embedded in the American character. These traits include leadership, self-sacrifice, inventiveness, and resilience, and also violence and brutality. We can see the self-sacrifice and commitment of Americans when we investigate the scarcity the Continental Army experienced and how its soldiers persisted in the fight. We can see American inventiveness when we look at examples like David Bushnell's The Turtle, and resilience when we think of Washington and his troops crossing the partially frozen Delaware River on Christmas night in 1776. But along with these positive traits go negative traits. Battles like Bunker Hill, Trenton and Princeton, Saratoga, and others allow us to see the brutality and violence Americans experienced and wrought. The War for Independence called for a lot of hand-to-hand combat, making this war personal, intimate, and very, very violent. We can also see Americans' penchant for violence and brutality every time we study the institution of slavery, or the work that Americans undertook to dispossess Native Americans from their land. Like all people, Americans are complicated. Their character is a mixture of the good, the bad, and lots of traits in between those two. And I think the point that Rick was trying to make in this conversation is that if we want to understand the American character and understand how it started, progressed, and how we can use that understanding to help us strive towards the American character we want to achieve, then we need to look at and better understand the American Revolution and its war for independence. You'll find more information about Rick, his book, The British Are Coming, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today, all in the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/280. See how SaneBox can magically remove distractions from your inbox with a 2-week free trial and a $25 credit. Visit sanebox.com/bfworld. That's sanebox.com/bfworld. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. And if you really love Ben Franklin's World and think our work is valuable, please consider joining the Ben Franklin's World subscription program at benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. Finally, what is the story or lesson that you think that we should take away from the American Revolution? I'd really love to know what you think, because this is such a large event in history and in American mythology that I suspect there are going to be a lot of different answers. So let me know. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.